Hello, hello.
We're so keen today. Kvitka, you and I are all here on time at 4, well, my time, 5 your time, on the dot.
Yeah, I've never been so punctual my entire life. So, yeah, like I'm punctual for Ukrainian spaces. How have you been doing?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. A little bit all over the place, which I guess we'll get to as we continue talking.
Yeah.
Kvitka, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's exactly what we'd be discussing all of today. Yeah. I was actually just on call with another Ukrainian student a couple of minutes ago, and he asked me how am I doing, and I said, just as everyone is, and he was like, yeah, I get that. So I think there's a standardized sort of overarching feeling that everyone is feeling, but we don't really have the words to describe it entirely.
Yeah.
I think
it's weird, right?
My favorite shortcut these days is a simple answer. I'm Ukrainian. So everybody, asks, "Oh, how you been doing?" I'm like, "I'm Ukrainian," and it's terrifically well put response for these questions, and I think it explains to everyone everything at once.
Yeah, I love it. Guys, I wanted to, for the first time, I think ever in my life, probably, I recently this week heard a Russian refer to what Russia is doing as Russian colonialism, which was great. I think the narrative is reaching far and wide.
139 million 100,099 people to go, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Kvitka,
yeah,
we will ask you to do the same thing that you already did, but this is the rule. We never introduce our featured Ukrainians and allow them to introduce themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So please feel free to share who you are, what you've been doing, and where you come from.
Hi everyone. Once again, thank you, Maksym and Val, for having me back on Ukrainian Spaces. I think that the work you're doing is truly incredibly important, as always. Because as we've already mentioned on many occasions, it's still nonetheless, 80 something days in, the problem of not highlighting or amplifying Ukrainian voices by large media outlets is still very much prevalent. And, in cases when Western media does interview Ukrainians, there still is some kind of a way in which they either try to put a spin on what we're saying or, impose some kind of an agenda. And that I'm saying entirely from my personal experience, but that we can get into later. My name is Kvitka. I am a third-year history and politics student at the University of Edinburgh. So I am still studying, but I'm also a co-executive of a cultural NGO called the Shadows Project, which was created in January of last year with two of my friends who are also the same age, who are also Ukrainian students abroad. And we created it with the purpose of essentially creating a platform that would allow Ukrainian youth to interact with their Ukrainian identity in a very multimedia way, while also trying to essentially popularize and preserve Ukrainian history and culture, and do so in a way that would, involve slightly more, I guess, fun spins on the topics mentioned, so that Ukrainian youth can reconnect with who they are in ways that go past, very bland Wikipedia articles and whatnot. And we really want to tap into the nuances of Ukrainian identity that go past the sort of more known elements of what Ukrainian identity is. What I've been doing lately is trying to finish the third year of my degree, which has been rather, leading to a burnout, which we will be talking about. But also at the same time running the NGO, we've launched a project aimed at helping Ukrainian museums and cultural institutions get access to protective equipment so that exhibition items and their collections are safe from the Russian invaders, while also spotlighting Ukrainian voices and testimonies in a project titled Letters from Ukraine, which you can also find on Instagram. where essentially we encourage people to send in any of their thoughts, emotions, feelings about everything in their life and anything in their life. And and on top of that, trying to create an online encyclopedia on everything Ukrainian with a cohort of other Ukrainian cultural initiatives, which keep your eyes peeled for that. So all in all, trying to stay productive in ways that would benefit Ukraine in every way possible.
Keeping busy is the only way to stay sane these days. And I just want to point out to everybody who's listening, we will definitely, because this is one of the most fantastic initiatives these days, and definitely as many people as possible should know and support it.
Thank you very much.
Kvitka, I want to jump straight into our topic. Especially, I think today is quite complicated because we're learning again after liberating some of the Ukrainian territories about the sheer horror of mass rape happening and mass murder that Russians did to villages, especially north of Kharkiv. And this is something that unfortunately we hear and see and read about too regularly these days. But it also adds up to a bit of feeling that I had today, like when the first time I was reading through those testimonies, they were coming from Bucha and Irpin and Mariupol. I was just crying for, I think, several days, and it was really traumatic. I think it will leave everyone scarred, no matter Ukrainian you are or not. These days, it is as traumatic, but I also see and feel quite a massive burnout. We talked on the previous episodes about vicarious trauma with Jane Litvinenko and how it affects the way we process information. But this is something, the burnout from all the things we've been experiencing last 85 years. It felt like 85 years. 85 days. This is something that every and each of us already experiencing on major level, but we still do not talk about it just because we don't think that it's very timely, or maybe it's a bit of guilt not to talk about something you feel while so many people are actually losing their lives. So is it the same situation with you? And if yes, how it manifests in your everyday life these days?
I mean, I think there, from a personal experience, there's a certain set of behaviors that I think I've started to exhibit or experience in relation to rather mundane aspects of day-to-day life, all of which nonetheless take their roots in the war and the larger overarching sort of context of one's experience of Ukrainianness today. Normally, yes, like I know that I'm a fairly sensitive person, but I've always had the ability to maintain a sense of rationality in situations I could identify as being bigger than myself. And all of that has gone out the window now, completely. I think what I've noticed in conversations with other Ukrainian friends is that all of us are experiencing extreme mood swings. And that the highs are really high because deep down, it's a matter of time before you're yanked out of that fleeting moment of happiness. And the lows are really low because there are so many things to be low about. And I think what makes it all the more complicated is the fact that whether we're aware of it or not, I think we're all in a constantly active process of grieving, which nonetheless is retained subconsciously. And it's not fully sort of manifested, I suppose, physically all the time. So when something prompts an emotional reaction out of you, whether it be to something entirely, again, something mundane, or if it's, a regular sort of quarrel with, say, a friend, the reaction that you have to it carries with it a little bit of that grieving too. So I think for me, what I've started to notice is the fact that just in general, I'm obviously a lot more emotional than I would be. But I'm a lot more emotional to things that also have absolutely nothing to do with Ukraine or the war, because I think in general, there's this, there's a kind of an emotional pendulum that I think all Ukrainians have right now, which is that you're constantly going back and forth between having, moments of distraction almost, where you come very close to forgetting what your reality is. And then there's always a photo, a memory, a voice note, a tweet, or something that brings you back. And immediately reminds you of the fact that, not everything is sunshine and roses. Which obviously makes it a lot more difficult to deal with just day-to-day life. But then at the same time, once you think about those things, there comes a feeling of guilt. Because I think it's something that weighs heavy on a lot of people's minds, because I think there's the question of how much one should be allowed to enjoy the simple things if they happen to be in that situation. And that's be it whether you're living abroad in a country with quiet skies or living in a part of Ukraine that appears relatively safe in contrast to the other. And I'm partial to the argument that, an attempt to enjoy simple things should be made, simply not to condition ourselves to get used to wartime survival mode as sort of being the permanent state of things. Because we have to remember the joys of life so that we have something to strive for and to fight for, which is what we're already doing as a whole country.
This is a needed topic right now. And Kvitka, the way that you've described how you feel and how many of us feel, I think is so something I can really relate to as well. And yeah, I think it's also like that guilt that you were talking about is something that we've spoken about before. We all feel it to a certain degree in one way or another, each one of us, and it makes it a little bit harder to continue with this. But I just wanted to, I know we've briefly spoken about this before, but I think also, why are we talking about burnout right now? I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience with this. And what I mean by that is that for quite a while, many of us, I'm not saying all of us, have been operating in this fight or flight mode, right? Like you said, war sort of survival mode. Which means that we're like hyper sort of attentive and hyper, we're really, 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 our body's reacting to trauma basically by, as though we're being like chased by a wild animal or something. We're just like on adrenaline, churning out, I don't know what it is, content, giving interviews, helping people, helping families, all of this stuff. And I guess now things, although for many people in Ukraine, they haven't slowed down, but in a way things have slightly slowed down. It's how I feel. And that's why there's like more time for us to go into that almost shutdown mode, right? And I was just wondering whether this is something just I'm feeling right now, or whether there's like some sort of collective peak that we've reached, that we're like all hitting a wall of burnout.
No, definitely. I think you're not alone at all. And I think that, when I think of a burnout in particular, I'm not a psychologist or an expert in this matter, but to my mind, the definition that comes is that, above all, it's characterized by kind of a lack of motivation and almost a kind of cynicism that you start to experience after a prolonged exposure to stress. And in my experience, the lack of motivation in particular, that strikes me ever so often. And I think it's something that all of us are starting to feel as well. It's exacerbated, or I think is furthered by the rather dwindling attention of non-Ukrainian audiences towards Ukraine, that I think as of right now, obviously we're 80 days in. Like you've said, in the first couple of weeks, I think the entire world was sort of driving on this adrenaline, this momentum of there was a kind of a shock factor that was very new to a lot of people, that made them want to pay attention. Now that everyone's getting used to it, I'm starting to encounter a kind of an internal dialogue within myself that goes somewhere along the lines of, we Ukrainians are giving hourly updates of developments from the ground, even 80 days in. We're sharing photos of atrocities committed by Russians on our land, which are already traumatizing enough for us to see, let alone engage with. We're having daily conversations with foreigners and constantly taking on the roles of, ambassadors, educators, activists, researchers, and so on. we're sharing infographics, we're compiling easy to understand and accessible explainers on Ukrainian culture, history, and whatever. We're with every possible citation and reference to legitimate source. We're doing everything to make Russian colonialism in Ukraine easy to understand, digestible, and simplified and explained in ways to the point of it being so simplified and explained that it would be almost too easy to put in a quote-unquote for dummies textbook. And yet, there are still people who will call bluff, those who will, simply avert their eyes, or at times even worse, those who will say, thank you very much, that information was great, and then go about their lives as usual.
Yeah,
with their subconscious, still very much untouched, and it being very clear that they haven't genuinely taken in the gravity of what Ukrainians are experiencing. So when 100%. I think about those things, sometimes my conclusion is, what is the point? And it's an almost shameful thing to admit, but there are times when I feel like just like giving up on the informational war that we're also fighting, because it seems like no matter how hard we're trying or how much we're talking, it still isn't enough. Because every day I see Ukrainians doing every possible thing to try and make the world listen, or, at the moment, to keep the world's attention on us and to remind everyone that the shock that everyone around the world, and Ukrainians more so, experienced on February 24th, it's still very much there for us, because seeing dead bodies of people killed for being who you are hasn't gotten any easier. And, hearing air raid sirens, despite that already being a joke amongst a lot of Ukrainians, it still is jarring. And, the guilt of being a Ukrainian living abroad while most of your family is in Ukraine, and being very aware of a kind of like a crevice almost appearing between you and them because of their lived experiences of being in Ukraine during the war and your lack thereof, that is still very hard to wrap your head around. So, we've been, practically running nonstop for the last 80 days with, updating the world on, actually physically fighting on, everyone mobilizing in every way possible. And I think, I think it's perfectly natural that we're getting to this point, but it also means that there are lessons for us to be learning along the way about the fact that whether we like it or not, we're in this in the long term.
Yeah,
of course.
Even if the war were to finish tomorrow, there would still be so much work for us to do immediately afterwards. So, with all of that in mind, we have to start, I suppose. It doesn't mean we have to slow down, but we have to definitely rethink how we're taking care of ourselves and how we're fighting.
Yeah, 100%. I think we need to actually think about how we're taking care of ourselves. And I know like some of us might feel like that's like selfish to ourselves, but actually if we don't start doing that and having conversations like we're having right now, then we will not be able to help other people and continue doing what we're doing. So that's just really important. And I think that's something all of us are realizing right now, because as much as we've been like trying to be as heroic as we can with continuing and doing everything, it's just been absolutely. I was just wondering, I don't know, you don't have to share this, but I think one of the things that really sometimes, I just one story of something that just sent me into a spin of oblivion and depression was when I was decided one of those times, how like you were saying, we need to like start, sometimes some of us, want to go and for 1 hour have, I don't know, a coffee or a drink with a friend or something. I went to someone's birthday party, and a person actually came up to me and said they don't want to be around me because they don't know what to say to me, and I'm making them feel sad. And I was like, what do you want me to respond to that? And I was just wondering, have you had any like bizarre interactions with people from the outside world who are still living their lives
fucked up thing
as nothing happened?
I don't know about you, Maksym, but because I've had similar interactions, to be honest. I've had to have a very, I've had to have a couple of conversations with people closest to me, And that was something I had initiated in the very first couple of weeks of the full-scale invasion, because I realized very early on that it wouldn't be sustainable for me or for everyone around me to maintain this sort of how would I describe this? In the first couple of weeks of the war, it got to the point where I'm the only Ukrainian in my immediate surroundings. So all of my friends and all of those closest to me who are all non-Ukrainians, all of them had downloaded Telegram and subscribed to every imaginable news source possible from Ukraine. And it got to the point where, from February 24th until maybe the midpoint of March, I would sometimes walk into, a friend's living room, and it would be full of people who are obviously not from Ukraine, and they would start giving me updates on what was happening back home, to the point where they'd be like, "Oh, have you heard about, the advancement near Kiev or something like that?" And then started giving me all these updates, and it quickly grew into, with a snowball effect. It got to the point where every single conversation was about home, and back then, obviously, understandably, as I've said, a lot of it was because of the shock. But I did sort of realize that I personally wouldn't be able to maintain a sense of, some kind of like mental stability if that were to keep going. So I had to have a couple conversations about the fact that, I appreciate the fact that everyone's, trying to stay updated. And if anything, most Ukrainians have the opposite problem with a lot of their foreign friends. But I had to have like an explicit conversation about boundaries and how to talk with me about these things. But that still didn't stop a couple of people that I knew from having a conversation with me about the fact that, they were getting concerned about the fact that I was getting distanced and that I was, they didn't know how to talk to me about these things because they've never experienced it. So they would really appreciate it if I would initiate these conversations. And it somehow then spun around into, I ended up coming out of the conversation feeling like it was my responsibility to force people into checking up on me almost. Which was slightly strange, I think, because
a little bit messed up as well, no?
Yeah. It made me feel a little bit like a nuisance, but also, I don't want to ask for people to have to check up on me and ask me how am I doing. So it was just a very strange conversation to have, I think, and I kind of came out of it with this, nonetheless, a very enforced feeling of the fact that regardless of how, because in my head I thought that everyone who follows the news should be able to decipher that if you are personally attached to, the images that you see from Bucha, from Irpin, and from whatever, that every person with, who's able to think would be able to understand that obviously if you have a personal attachment to it, you wouldn't be doing great, and it's not something that you would need to vocalize.
This is probably the reason, this is my manifestation of my burnout, that I try to limit conversations with non-Ukrainians on social occasions. Of course, I have to do a lot in line of work and a line of volunteering these days. But when it comes to social engagements, like, I don't know, going for a coffee with a friend who is not Ukrainian, or something like that, I try to not to do it exactly because I'm burned out as fuck. I cannot handle conversations with people, even if I love them and I really value them. But I definitely know that the reactions sometimes, or the questions, or just some circumstances might feel me really uncomfortable, and I just have no capacity to deal with that. And actually, I want to invite Ashley, who is our patron family, and she actually had a very cool question specifically related to that, because we're doing Ukrainian spaces for Ukrainians, but also for our friends and allies to learn and educate themselves a bit better how to deal, not only about Ukraine, but how also be a good ally to Ukrainians. Ashley, hey, I think you had a question specifically linked to that when it comes to Ukrainian friends and how to be more attentive or more sensitive towards how your Ukrainian friends are going through stuff.
I do. Hi, everybody. I I would love to be the customs officer who saw the wine and chocolate try to come through their customs station. But I wanted to know if there's a way for Westerners or allies to support Ukrainians who are experiencing burnout right now.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Ashley.
thank you.
Kvitka.
And thank you so much for supporting Ukrainian spaces as well. Yeah, that's
Absolutely.
fantastic
Yeah.
question. Kvitka, please go ahead.
Oh, honestly, if I'm completely honest, Ashley, I think one of the things that accompanies this burnout that a lot of Ukrainians are experiencing, and at least for me, is also a complete inability to make any decisions or understand what you want. Um, and that applies to even me trying to figure out how I wish people would interact with me or how I wish my foreign friends and loved ones would interact with me. So that is quite a big issue for me. But I think in general, an excellent way to support any Ukrainians right now is over something you're already doing, which is, for example, helping Val and Maksym go on with having Ukrainian spaces and contributing to Ukrainian spaces. But also, I think what's helped me a lot is with a lot of my foreign friends is what makes me, feel slightly better is when I see them interact with Ukraine, but not just with the subject of what's going on there right now, but also with just all things Ukrainian, because I think one of my biggest worries about all of this is that once we inevitably end up at the finish line and the victory is ours, that the world will come to associate Ukraine with being a temporary wartime zone, but something that nonetheless will always be associated with war and tragedy and killings and whatnot. And that obviously is now a horrible mark in our history, but it is not all that Ukraine is or has to offer or ever had to offer. So to me personally, it brings me a lot of joy to see non-Ukrainians actively support causes that try to highlight the aspects of Ukrainian history and culture when foreigners try to, for example, learn Ukrainian and Ukrainian phrases. When one of the things that my friends in university did, none of whom are Ukrainian, in I think the second week of the war, which was incredibly wonderful on their part, was they surprised me by making me a fully Ukrainian dinner. None of them knew how to make borscht or vareniki or any of that, but they surprised me with a full table of Ukrainian dishes that I hadn't had in a very long time. And seeing them put the kind of effort to learn more about my culture and my identity and who I am, it brought me a little bit of hope, because it's very, I think you also have to understand that Ukrainians right now are with us. We also carry this, I think, repressed feeling, or at least this is something I experience, of a feeling like our identity and our culture had been ignored for a very, very long time. And this is a very unfortunate way for the world to start paying attention to us. So I think educating yourself, interacting with Ukrainian, anything Ukrainian really, but especially the positive aspects of it, financially supporting Ukrainian creators, and also by simply sharing their content does a lot to help. Anything to do with amplifying Ukrainian voices, it deserves, all the recognition in the world.
Yesterday was Vyshyvanka's Day, which celebrates fantastic fashion piece of Ukrainian culture. And, we were so overjoyed to see so many people wearing it, Ukrainians proudly. This is also a special occasion because, this is not the first Vyshyvanka Day, but for the first time I felt kind of a privilege to wear it, but also privilege of mine that I have an opportunity not being under bombardments and wearing it and showcasing it, whereas so many people I know are on the front line and didn't have that opportunity. And some foreigners actually asked me, like, well, guys, do you mind if foreigners wear it and showcase it? Don't you think it's a bit of cultural appropriation? And I got like plenty of questions like that. And I think I answered, I cannot speak on behalf of all Ukrainians, but I answered to all of them that personally I don't mind. Moreover, yesterday it helped me. It's actually helped me because people did celebrate Ukrainian culture. They learned about Vyshyvanka. They learned about the bazillion patterns from different Ukrainian regions, and it filled me with joy.
I learned too.
Yeah. And you put a fantastic post about it. And I know Tatiana, who's also part of our Ukrainian Spaces family, she also put a lot of stuff out there, both in Instagram and Twitter. And I'm going to pin something about that, celebrating Vyshyvanka, but also celebrating Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian cultural imprint in Europe and worldwide.
Yeah. And also, I think just on this note, I read somewhere, I think there was like a big discussion when Kalush won Eurovision, because, you know, the outfits that they wore were obviously like super national Ukrainian outfits. And there was like a discussion on some Ukrainian website I found about like cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. And the main thing was like, cultural appreciation is when people fully acknowledge the history and the meaning and where like the thing comes from when they wear something, you know, as opposed to just wearing something because it looks cool. You wear it because you want to celebrate that culture. So at least, again, we can't really speak for everyone, but at least that's how I feel for sure. Like if you're wearing a Vyshyvanka because you want to show support to Ukraine and you know what it means for us, and you know what it has meant for us, and you understand what expressing our like national identity means for us right now, then you're super welcome to do it. And as Maksym says, it helps as well. And then just quickly on Kvitka's point, first of all, I want your friends who cooked you a Ukrainian meal. But second of all, I have a friend who actually comes to our spaces quite often, so I'll give him a little shout out, Dante, who texts me almost every day in Ukrainian, like "Як справи?" How are you? Just in Ukrainian.
Yeah.
I think Tatiana, he was sharing like your post as well with me, where you gave people like basically translation of little cool words that people can use in their day-to-day lives. And I thought that was just so nice.
I actually, it's speaking on speaking Ukrainian, really. I have the same thing where my partner started just speaking to me in Ukrainian. Like he started just learning Ukrainian. I mean, before the war started already, but now he just tries to say to me, you know, a couple of times a day. He will just say a couple words to me, and it will immediately kind of make me feel a little bit more at home, because also living abroad, I don't have a lot of opportunity to, I mean, speak Ukrainian really, unless I'm calling my family. So it's been really nice to know that my friends will sometimes, you know, just they've learned a couple phrases, but they will use them every now and again, and it's really nice to see them sort of Ukrainian making its way into their daily vocabulary, which is, I think, very sweet, especially so because, you know, it just reminds me of how far we've come, and that, you know, we used to be persecuted for speaking Ukrainian, and now the whole world is celebrating a song entirely sung in Ukrainian, and is learning Ukrainian on their own as well.
Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm here. I feel a little awkward on the timing, but I know I'm probably going to butcher this, but I wanted to say Dyakuyu for your great answer.
Дякую теж.
Dyakuyu.
I'm gonna thank you, Ashley. I'm gonna add Tatiana because we already shared so much of her stuff. It's only fair for her to have a say. Hey, Tatiana.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
I always feel like it's such a nice little group, part of the family. You're right. It makes me smile because I also am so far away. I feel like that this is kind of feels like a group hug. No, I was going to actually add. I was going to actually add to the burnout conversation that I was reaching a very saturated level. I think probably, I don't know, a week ago. I was getting to the point where I couldn't sleep and my brain felt very full, and it felt kind of insurmountable suddenly, just the volume of information and the amount of kind of the pedaling that we all have to do to make sure that we just keep going, and I kind of was reaching that kind of burnout place. And I swear that Vyshyvanka Day came at the perfect time, because suddenly it felt like the world was kind of coming back together again and having this renewed purpose and renewed energy. So I was going to add to all the wonderful points that everybody's been making, is that the narrative, because Vyshyvanka Day got everybody to look away from the war narrative and got them to understand what the background to Nashi Vyshivani Sorochke, like what the shirts are kind of representing. And, it got me to kind of start reminding people that you can kind of still reach out and say certain Ukrainian words. I think it gave me a renewed purpose. So it was like Vyshyvanka Day was this collective day of leaning in, it felt like, which was really wonderful.
Yeah, it was really great to actually. Kvitka has one of the best vyshyvankas, because that's how I initially messaged you asking, like, where's your vyshyvanka from? I want the same one.
Yeah, my family is from Western Ukraine, and we're very fortunate to, we have quite the collection in the family. And the one I wear is quite literally over 100 years old. It used to belong to my great grandmother that we've somehow managed to miraculously save. So yeah, but I think Vyshyvankas to a lot of families are just their pride and joy, but also for me, it always makes, when I put one on, I instantly feel very much in touch with my ancestors, as strange as that sounds, because, a lot of the times traditional Vyshyvankas are handmade entirely. And when you take a look at any of the Ukrainian patterns, you can immediately see just the amount of work that would be put into one, because the patterns are just so, they're so intricate and so complicated with so many rich colors that, you just know that there has to be some kind of an incredibly powerful meaning behind it, that you can almost, I don't think you can really describe it. It's just something you feel. Like, I think of Vyshyvanka as very much something that when you put it on, you immediately feel a sensation that a lot of Ukrainians will be able to identify, but maybe not necessarily describe in words. But I wanted to go back to the burnout topic. Sorry. You just reminded me, Val, when you brought up Kalush, that I saw this really interesting tweet that actually I thought it had a thesis in it that I personally could relate to. That talked about the fact that, for example, the Eurovision win was important to Ukrainians, not just in a sense of like, a morale boost, which obviously was nonetheless, I think, very needed. But also in that it created a kind of it gave us a feeling of being able to have a timeline in mind, which I think a lot of people weren't able to do before. And that even with something as, someone could say it's trivial, but with something like Eurovision, nonetheless, the expectation that we're hosting Eurovision in a year's time, Ukraine will be welcoming tourists from all over the world to come in May next year. That already sort of created something in everyone's minds to look forward to, but also brought with it, I think, the hope that, that by that point we will be a restored free Ukraine. And that very much has kind of, I think, the reason I think it relates to the burnout subject is because, like I've said before, for me, the burnout idea has carried with it a complete inability to, instability or lack of structure has started causes an immediate sort of emotional reaction from me, because I need to have a plan, because, not knowing what's ahead of you reminds me too much of what's happening at home, because realistically I don't know what to expect from from home right now. And so I've started applying this to my day-to-day life, in that if I don't know what I'm doing, tomorrow, then I start to get incredibly stressed, because uncertainty is something that is very difficult to deal with right now. And I'm personally trying to eliminate in every aspect of my life, so that I can at least have control over some things when I don't have any control, or that much control over what's happening back home.
Yeah. 100%. I was just going to ask you as well, before I think we only have 10 minutes left, but I was going to ask you, like, what are your coping mechanisms? What have you been doing to try and deal with, your feelings of burnout when you are descending into that? But
also to add important aspect, what would you recommend not to do, not so it doesn't get worse, both for fellow Ukrainians, but also for our friends and allies to learn?
I think for Ukrainians, I mean, this is from my personal observations of people I know. I think Ukrainians have a tendency to be workaholics a lot of the time. And I think the important thing, first of all, is to not put ourselves in overdrive, and that, you have to be very, I think you have to be good with selecting what you're fighting for, and what causes are worth pursuing, and what battles are worth fighting. And I mean that not in the literal sense, but in a sense of, if you're, for example, arguing with someone who very clearly has very little grasp on what's happening at the moment, yes, sometimes it's good to educate people, but at the same time, you have to be considerate of whether or not you personally, in terms of your energy levels and your mind, your mind space, if you are capable, or if you can afford really to have a conversation that will inevitably end up being very draining for you, and potentially not even so productive in regards to the other person. So I think you need to be very good at, at prioritizing really where you're putting your efforts, and how you're spending them. A good piece of advice that I saw in the very beginning stages of the full scale invasion actually was in terms of, I think a lot of us found ourselves in a position of, what can I do to be useful? And someone I saw had written something about the fact that you have to just stick to what you're good at. Don't try to do everything at once. Don't, if you've never fundraised before, don't suddenly become an expert on it, because there are people who can fill up that space. If you know that you're good at writing, for example, and writing is your forte, then you can come up with a way to put that to good use, and that automatically makes it easier for you, and also makes it more productive in the long run. But also, you're allowed to take breaks, and all of us are allowed to take breaks. I think that there's, and I've suffer from this as well, is that, there is a very much this feeling that you have to be aware of everything happening at this all at once. And that, I struggle sometimes with putting my phone away, for example, because I feel like the moment I do, what if something important happens and I don't find out about it until an hour later, and then I'm late to the party and I can't discuss it. And, then ultimately, again, it's all about feeling like you have control over something. You have control over your intake of information. You have control over your knowledge of the situation. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is important to take breaks, because if you are constantly at the receiving end of the influx of information that we're receiving from back home, which is a crazy amount of information, you are not going to rest. Inevitably, you're going to get tired. And when you're tired, you're not able to work efficiently, and you're not going to be able to be useful if that's what you want to be. So breaks are important. Pick your battles. Take care of yourself. But ultimately, I wanted to highlight, I think it's a pretty good source. There's a website called Kvitka Info that was made by the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture and the Strategic Communications and Informational Defense Center. And in it, they actually have quite a few resources on how to deal with fatigue, with panicking anxiety, with just like in general psychological support during the war advice. And I think it's actually pretty pretty well written, or it's a good beginning step if you feel stuck. So for anyone feeling like they need like a concrete list of sources, that's a pretty good one to consult, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. And bizarrely, this is exactly what my mom always tells, and she lives under bombardments, and so this is probably a mom thing to do to take care. Sorry, this is not the place that I wanted to go, and now I'm just like choking on a bit tears. But yeah, sorry. But she keeps telling me that, yeah, this is something you have to do. You cannot be constantly on the news or checking. And this is something that even she does all the time, despite that she cannot escape the war. And she here and war comes to her everyday life with some explosions that she hears, or she even walks sometimes outside, and if the fighting happening like 30-40 kilometers away, she feels the soil trembling under her feet. But then she does this, and she says that she even feels better if she can turn off her phone and force herself not to read all the time. And if she can do it, I think people like us who are not there, especially those who are doing it because they are just scared for their loved ones, you won't be of much help if you're completely burnt out. And
Yeah.
when time comes and crisis situation hits and you're completely ran out of any energy or opportunity to think clearly, there
Yeah.
won't be much use of you.
It's going to be a nice way to wrap up. I don't know. But I wanted to share my way of this week, I guess, that I've been trying to deal with my emotions and my feelings, which is that I've tried to find and read Ukrainian poetry more of Ukrainian authors and Ukrainian, basically Ukrainian poets and other people who have basically written about Ukraine in our previous years of existence of Ukraine. And I wanted to read a couple to you guys before we close, just because I think it really shows to us Ukrainians right now that we are going through something that people before us went through, and really makes us connected to our roots in a weird way, which I found really healing this week. But I'm sure like loads of you have heard of Taras Shevchenko. If you haven't, he's a big Ukrainian, probably the most famous Ukrainian poet, and Lesya Ukrainka, who's the most famous woman who's been writing poetry as well. But I wanted to read two. One from Vasyl Simonenko, which I translated myself, just a couple of lines, and one from Lesya Ukrainka, just to see if you guys can feel the same way I do when I read it. But Vasyl Simonenko basically, okay, I'll read it. I'll just go and read it. So his poem reads, "You can live or you can exist. You can think or you can repeat, but your soul cannot be warmed by those who do not burn with passion." And I think that quite nicely describes all of us Ukrainians right now. And then Lesya Ukrainka's poem, from actually a poem that is called "Against All Hope, I Hope," which I think is just the most amazing, how many words? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words that I've heard in the past 3 months. But again, a little bit from her poem, which reads, "Yes, I will laugh despite my tears. I'll sing out songs amidst my misfortunes. I'll have hope despite all odds. I will live away you sorrowful thoughts." So even though our ancestors and people that came before us have felt the pain that we're feeling, they still found a way to express themselves and are now helping us the way that I hope one day will help people who'll come after us.
Also, our Patreon space, please join it, support us, because we're a 100% independent volunteer effort. And thanks to our patrons, we can do a better job This is not a charity. You get bonus content. You get a lot of interesting stuff extra, but also you get a front seat and you can ask your questions if you'd like through Patreon space or live in person. So I think that's it. Hopefully I didn't forget anything. Except one thing. Slava Ukraini.
Героям
Героям
слава.
слава.
I was just going to say that.
Okay, guys. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
all.
Bye. Thank you.